Anicka, thank you so much for allowing us to visit you for a virtual studio visit. That's beautiful. Where exactly are you right now?
I'm in Long Island City. Thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be here talking with you. You did make a joke about our studio visit potentially going 2.5 hours. I will say that for the record, I once had a 7-hour studio visit. It went to 1 a.m. in the
Oh, wow.
morning, and I think I almost nearly perished by the end of it. I was really thirsty
I,
and hungry.
I promise I won't do this. I promise I won't.
But
Anicka, one
I have
question.
stamina.
So are you at home or are you in your studio right now?
I'm at home. My studio is in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and we are not inhabiting the studio at the moment. We being myself and my 3 assistants.
Mhm. And can you work from home, or are you in a moment where you use this moment as a pause to reflect? How are you faring with this? How are you dealing with this moment right now?
I am not surprised. We are adapting remarkably. We have a ton of work to do, and we are pivoting some of the work that we have to do into digital forms and digital formats, which I imagine a lot of artists are doing at the moment. And so we are incredibly busy, and we are actually working in a much more, I would say, productive and fluid way. Partially that's to do with me, and I tend to have a very busy traveling schedule normally, outside of COVID-19, and that sometimes jostles the work environment, the studio environment. But because I've been here consistently, sheltering in place with everyone else, we've just it's almost like we've become one organism, one entity, and we're working very well together.
Yeah, a friend of mine who is a trustee at the museum here, she asked me if we go to London for Freeze this autumn a couple of months ago. And I said, yeah, of course we have to go because Anicka is you are doing the Turbine Hall. Is this a project you're following through right now?
Absolutely, full steam ahead. We are operating under the schedule that we would have regardless of COVID-19. So, we want to imagine that we are going to open in October and that we want to complete our work. And we're really fortunate because we were working, a lot of our team is working remotely. So I'm working with 2 engineers here in New York who we're developing behavior software. And then we have some hardware manufacturers in Stuttgart, Germany. So everybody is working diligently, and we have not been thwarted with our scheduling as far as the work that we're able to do. So I'm very, very pleased about that.
That's great news. That's great news. I'm really looking forward because there is, at some point, I remember a couple of years ago, 2015, 2016, we had the Ebola crisis. And I remember seeing a video of you, or it was an article, and I remember you said basically, hey, we are in New York City. This is such a dense urban environment, and they're viral pathogens. And you were one of the very first people who made me aware of it, because of course your work is between art and science and art. And actually Aggie Gant, who as the chairperson of MoMA PS1, I came to her and I said, Aggie, I'm gonna install hand sanitizers in every office. So when now Corona happened, I got a message from the staff and I said, thank you so much for installing hand sanitizers in every office. We couldn't understand it for 5 years, but now they make sense. Did you, in your work, was there a premonition of this, or are you anyway very in tune with density provoking a reaction in society? Is that something that is for you anyway a concern?
Well, my work is about life forms. It's about organisms. It's about microbiological processes. So while I am not clairvoyant and I didn't predict the COVID-19 virus, I am very attuned to the biological world around us and how we're all interconnected. I have been currently speaking a lot, whether it's podcasts or I'm currently helping to edit 12 pages for the Art Forum COVID-19 issue, for instance, that's coming out this summer. And we're addressing a lot of these issues around virology. And so it is very clear to me that that we are interconnected and interdependent as these biological entities and these forces, whether you're plants, animals, insects, microbes, or human. And so as far as I made an exhibition in response to the Ebola virus in 2015. I remember the nurse, the female nurse who had to get quarantined in New Jersey because she had come back from Africa, and she had contracted the virus. And I just remember that video that you were referencing was a video about me talking about the sort of genesis, the inspiration, the origin story behind this exhibition. And I thought about this nurse, and I thought about linking this kind of potency of this woman in isolation, and the potency of linking this viral sort of pathogenic spread, and linking that with feminism and female networks and how women can help each other, and so on and so forth. So with the onset of COVID-19, I think one of the best feelings that I've had is first and foremost, my core studio team saying, oh, well, we're not as scared as we normally would be, because we've been studying a lot of these ideas about contagion and hygiene and the social anxiety that comes around what I've been calling the biopolitics of the senses. Because human beings like ourselves, we experience our reality, we perceive our reality through an embodied intelligence, through our senses. There is no separation where you just have a cognitive understanding of your reality or your world or your environment. Everything is immersive, and so we are interconnected. And I don't want to go into a lecture about virology, but I've had to educate myself tremendously in the last 6 weeks, as I'm sure a lot of you who are watching this have had tried to educate yourselves as well. And one of the important things that I've learned is this virus really destabilizes what it means to consider the living and the non-living, because viruses are technically not living entities, and yet they are the oldest living biological matter on the planet, and they help to regulate living systems. And the human genome contains 8% virus as well. So, I think that we have this anxiety that this contagion or this pathogen isn't out there, but it's also inside of us. And what I've been trying to do with my work is explore this interconnective tissue of all living things and all living systems that we are a part of, and that that we cannot think of nature in these absolute terms as these taxonomies of these species, these exquisite species that are separated from all other life, because that's just simply not true. And the things that concern me in this moment is this real this turning our back against science and all the developments and advancements we've made with science. And there are people out there in 2020 who believe the earth is flat. And there is our current administration who is telling people to drink bleach and Lysol. And so as somebody who is deeply invested in scientific advancement and processes, it's a stunning blow. We've made so much progress learning about microbiological processes. We've made so much advances with synthetic biology, and to have this kind of, deep mistrust of science is very deeply disturbing for me.
I have a question. I remember you once said, you're optimistic for life, but not necessarily optimistic for humans. Because of course you mentioned very carefully, you say, oh, living things, beings, organisms. So there is an optimism for life in itself, but not necessarily for humans. You have worked in the rainforest, in the Amazon. You went down the Rio Negro for 800 miles. And I remember when we acquired a piece, there was a group of curators who was discussing whether this was chemical or biological, or if this was corrosion. Is actually corrosion a physical, chemical, biological, biochemical process? Say a bit what you mean when you say you're optimistic for life, but not necessarily for humans.
Well, life will continue on and on and on. The thing is that evolution will not cease just because certain species go or become extinct. And so in terms of what we consider our own species, which I have some issues with, because, this substance that we call the human is actually a consortium of multi-species. And that was what, my exhibition in Brussels at Gladstone Gallery was about. It was about addressing that we are not what we think of ourselves as the self, when the self is constituted by a multitude of different species in the form and the vessel of a human being as we know it. We're mostly comprised of trillions of bacteria and fungi, and that sort of outweighs this substance that we call the human. So these sort of taxonomies of these species, I have some questions around. But in terms of your question around not so hopeful about humans, I mean, perhaps we are experiencing the last stages of our evolutionary process. Because I say that because we are splintering into different directions through genetic engineering, where we are becoming increasingly more hybridized. And then you have the machine intelligence that we're also merging with. So as much as I'm trying to, and we can get into this when we get into the slideshows, but we are becoming more cyborgian in the Donna Haraway sense, increasingly, but we're also having to, I think, have to biologize these machines as well. So in terms of the human, what we think of this substance as the human, that in itself, I think, is a fallacy. But in terms of where we're heading evolutionarily, I think that we're definitely seeing a splinter and an exchange and a difference than what we historically thought of the human 300 years ago. And that is evolution, and we can't really fight it. And in the same way that when we think about machine intelligence, we think, oh my gosh, does that disrupt evolution? Does genetic engineering disrupt evolution? Absolutely not. You can't destroy nature and you can't destroy evolution. It's one and the same. And so we're a part of that system. And so, I had a young friend who asked me, and in this time of COVID-19 was feeling very bleak and down. And she said, oh, there's no future for humans. And I promptly had to disagree. I said, no, we do have a future. We're going to become a part of everything else, the fabric of an ecosystem, and our bodies will decompose, and the microbes will then fulfill its process with all other biological entities. And in that sense, I don't really lament or feel tragic about what we think about the human not continuing for another 5 billion years or something.
I think there's a very interesting merging that I'm not an artist and I'm not a scientist, just a dilettante observer. but I think there is a merging of the outsourcing into electronic media, smartphones. There is an outsourcing of being able to calculate or to memorize phone numbers. There is a learned helplessness that cyborgian, we dislocate functions that we used to have in us into objects. And I think the very revealing part for the last eight weeks is, if you just take the word viral, I think there is a viral quality. Of course, coronavirus is a virus, and we now are thrown back at what it really in the origin of the word, in its meaning is when something goes viral. But perhaps we are in the first time in society where for many of us, viral meant something different. It meant something that was about communication, that was about going viral in terms of attention. And I think there is a strange, it's happening at the same time, this virus crisis and the virus perception. So there's something very, very important that is revealing itself while we go, because I think no crisis could have been perceived this way before the other meaning of viral and the other interconnectivity. Just the fact that we are talking right now is part of this evolution, perhaps making all of us obsolete in a way. When you talk about, it's a very beautiful quote. You once said, an artist has to be the perfect contradiction at all times. So with that said, I think that's a beautiful way to get into your work, because we want to look at your work and talk, looking at the work about exactly these materials and strategies and your way of understanding and visualizing the world, Anicka. So you helped us put together like a slideshow, and we start with a work of 2015. Mm-hmm. But I actually want to point, I want to point 1 year earlier. In 2014, you created a work that's now actually in the MOCA collection. And you want to say a bit about this point in your career, looking at these works, because you started relatively late practicing as an artist, right? You were born in Korea, you moved to the United States and moved around, and only at age 35 you became an artist. What made you decide, now I'm an artist?
It's funny because so yes, I was born in Korea. I came to the States when I was 2 years old with my family. I grew up in the South and Southern California. And, I didn't go to art school. I studied film theory. I didn't have the permission, as it were, the pedigree, the credential, the encouragement, the permission to make art. So I think art to me represented something more abstract, something more, I don't know, maybe even something more rigorous than what you would get a diploma for. To me at the time, it was very intangible. But I also was deferring the notion of becoming an artist because I was just not sure how to articulate my voice. I actually thought I was going to articulate my voice through cinema and film. And so I actually didn't consider myself an artist until 5 years into my practice, because I never thought that this would actually stick and endure. And when I first started making art, people would disclaim my work and say, well, that's not art. And I didn't feel compelled to defend it as art because I didn't feel qualified. And I thought, well, maybe it isn't art, but maybe it doesn't matter to me whether it qualifies as art or not art. And I just kept trying to push these questions that I had. And I think without having those rules, the conditioned rules, I could enter art in a different way, perhaps. It allowed a certain amount of freedom, and it allowed a certain level of, I think, dare I say, innocence or something, because I just didn't know the rules the way that everyone else did that had the training, who had gone to art school, as it were. And so when I first sort of considered myself an artist was really only when there was a certain consensus that this was something of value to other people who were highly qualified, much more than I am, to consider or appraise what art is. But that in itself, I don't take a tremendous amount of comfort in thinking, oh, well, now I'm an artist, therefore, I have some level or measure of security in my identity or something. I think that, if I weren't doing what I do now as an artist, I would still be tackling these questions as a microbiologist, or as an environmental lawyer, or as someone who is deeply connected to these issues. And I say that because as an artist, it's my job to push these questions, but I have this communing with a lot of other disciplines. And that's how I like to work. I work with, forensic chemists. I work with biologists. I work with perfumers. I work with musicians. And so to me, being an artist is about being a part of a collective conversation. It's not really about this sort of isolation of a lone genius up on a mountaintop. I don't subscribe to that notion of what an artist is. I'm the kind of artist who is very much in the world, who's very plugged into the global concerns and the issues and the real questions around civilization and where we're heading. So in that sense, I feel very fortunate to be a part of a collective conversation.
Did you ever consider becoming a scientist when you were, like, let's say between 12 and 15? When I think back myself, between 12 and 15, I kind of knew everything that later materialized, despite the fact that 10 years afterwards, I thought, oh, I didn't know anything. What were you thinking of doing professionally when you were in that age bracket?
Oh gosh, I mean, I think I really wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a novelist. I think that I had a very strong connection to language. I had a very strong connection to fiction. I had a strong connection to books. And, being a kind of a nerdy outcast kind of person, I was a bit of a shut-in, and I stayed at home and read a lot of books while other people were going out and partying and being popular and those kinds of things. I know that sounds very cliche, this story that I'm telling right now, but I was deeply immersed in the world of books and writing, and it's still so much frames so much of the kind of work that I do in my practice. I have gone on record to say I write a lot of backstories to my sculptural work. And this is work, the writing that nobody will ever see. No one will ever really, unless, I don't know, maybe it'll pop up in my memoirs one day. But writing is a very first step in my creative process.
If you describe, you say you were describing materials or your practice. If you describe this work, you selected this as the first piece we look at. How would you describe it yourself?
Oh gosh, it's great because I haven't seen this image in a while, and
Lapidary Tea Slave. What a name! What a title!
It's a little startling. So how would I describe this? I would say that there is, from a distance, a very biomorphic sort of associations. I would say that there's a language around hybridity. One of the very first sort of sculptural artworks that I made were these tempera fried flowers. And so what you don't see is a very, very fragrant sculpture inside of this inflatable vinyl structure. And so I wanted to convey this sort of, this tension, this contradiction of this containment of this smell. But how would I describe what we're seeing? I would say that it's there's an abject quality. I think abject is a very common word in the lexicon around my work, and I find abject qualities to be quite beautiful, though. And so there is that element, but there is this kind of very sort of almost like overflowing organism that seems very threatening, that seems incredibly sort of like assertive, that then we have these sort of industrial, sort of inflatable structures to try to contain that which we are threatened by, and this kind of this sort of like biological organism that just seems like it's growing and growing exponentially. And so this is kind of almost like this collision between the human reflex to control and contain the natural world. And so that's kind of how a starting point of how I would describe this work.
You described smell as the one sense that's most often associated with the female gender. You described smell as something that then other than other senses. And just for everybody who has not seen that piece in real, this is basically the lapidary tea slave. This is a sculpture. When you read the Materialist, I would never read the Materialist, but with you, I love reading the Materialist. Sounds like a shopping list. Mylar, plastic, resin, tempurified flowers, LED lights, plexiglass, and wood. This is life size. You could be in that bubble. You have these flowers, but you're depriving the audience. The viewer, the person who would smell, from that sense of smell that's caught inside. Is that, are you holding back from the viewer, or do you want the viewer to just imagine that?
I think that I think both statements could be true. That I want to elicit this kind of sort of tension, but also that this is a compulsion to try to contain that which we find destabilizing, that which we find uncomfortable. And so it's a direct statement around our relationship to olfaction, around these again, what I call the biopolitics of the senses. And what I'm trying to say is that, a lot of our senses and biological impulses, they're socially constructed. They are socially conditioned. And so when you said that I made this statement that, this sense of smell is closely associated with the feminine, I don't agree with that. I am just stating that that is a conditioning that we humans have created, and that we have also assigned these genders, which is kind of ridiculous, but we assign these kinds of gender associations with our senses. So ocularity, vision being sort of associated with knowledge, discovery, information, and we historically have associated that with the masculine. And currently in our evolutionary development, I would probably, everyone here would agree that our sense of sight, our vision, is probably our most primary sense that we activate, especially when we are experiencing art. And this is why I work with smell and olfaction, because I'm interested in entering art from different senses, entering art as an experience in ways that we haven't really done before historically. And so, smell is a very important sense for me to work with, because it's pre-verbal. We experience smell in the limbic system, that part of the brain that is precognition, pre-verbal. It's the place where we create memories, but we don't really understand it so well. And I think that that's a really vital sort of entry point into art, precognitive, pre-verbal, and deeply immersed in the sensorial. And that is really like my first introduction into art making. Again, not knowing the rules
Yeah.
and just sort of entering that way.
It's an incredibly specific way, and as you say in that quote I quoted you, was the contradiction of the artistic approach by itself. I think everybody else watched Outbreak and Contagion and all of these movies recently again, and of course there's all these inflatables and suits that people walk around with, and of course this is also a way of containing, of separating, because this mylar is not a membrane. It's not a membrane. It is containing. It's not porous. The air stays in, nothing goes out. I remember when we installed the piece here in the museum that people were afraid. They said, oh, there's mold inside. What if the mold is outside? And I said, basically, it's a pneumatic bubble. It's not porous. It stays inside. And for me, it's so interesting to look at materials that you're using. Perhaps we go to the next slide. And I remember seeing this in the galleries. And I had seen those pneumatic bubbles and environments, and I was fascinated by the processes that I imagine or perceive in there. And then I saw this, and I first didn't even think that was a work of yours. Do you want to describe where this body of work came from and what you're thinking behind it is?
Sure. This is an artwork that was part of an exhibition at the Friedrichsmuseum in Kassel, Germany in 2016. I want to say. Yes. I'm terrible with dates. But so this is an extension of my exploration into, biological processes and evolutionary processes. And I was really thinking a lot about hybridities. As humans, we are, a function of hybridity, as I mentioned before, that we are a consortium of different multi-species. And so I wanted to extend that into a sculptural sort of vocabulary. And, we exist because we are a result of mutations. So I was deeply fascinated by mutations in biology, mutations in sculpture, mutations in art. And so this is ostensibly, it's a hybrid, sort of, inspired by wasp nests, but it's also got this sort of like a digital timer connected to it, that it could be a potential bomb, a potential explosive of sorts, but it's also a lamp because it's lit from within. And so I wanted to sort of interweave these sensual impressions of the biological world with the technological machine industrial world, and create these new developments in genetics and biotechnology. It's a direct reference with that. And so I would say that a lot of this work that we're looking at and that we'll be talking about this afternoon, it's really under the rubric of what my colleague Carolyn Joan has coined biofiction. You could describe my practice as a kind of biofiction. And what biofiction to me means is that biology needs to find its narrative. You cannot separate biology from its narrative in the way that we can't separate today what's happening with COVID-19 from the narrative of this kind of, overlapping of multiple species, and this new term that we're probably all learning, zoonotic spillover. We'll get to that later, but yeah. I'm fascinated by these new kinds of ideas of when we have this kind of overlap and hybridity. And that's what I was trying to address in 2016 with this exhibition that you can't contain. So the slide before was this attempt at, in the Kunsthalle Basel exhibition with these inflatable structures to try to contain. And then a year later, I'm just sort of saying, well, we can't really contain it. We just should acquiesce, and we should embrace this sort of hybridization, this mutation, because mutation makes life possible. We are
Mm.
byproducts as human beings of mutations. We evolved out of the ocean. We evolved from bacteria. We evolved from animals, and we're all a part of a similar system. And that's what I am trying to say with my practice and with my language.
If we go to the next slide, talking about mutation, I remember seeing these the first time. And of course, they look basically also like a mutation of what you are expected to, what you do expect when you think about a painting or a sculpture or something that relief that basically could be described in both ways. And then I remember the very first time I perceived these, they feel like as if they were nearly slightly wet. What is the material? What is this material that you cover the framing sculptural part of the work with?
So this material is silicone, and it's been made from a mold that resembles chicken skin. So I created a mold from chicken skin and those goose pimples or goosebumps that chicken skin has, and then I created a very large panels of silicone, and each panel that we're seeing right now has sewed in hundreds and hundreds of pieces of microfilament or fishing wire, as it's commonly known. And so to give that kind of heightened sort of synthetic chicken skin, chicken hair, goosebump sort of feeling. And this is really, I mean, as innocuous as this looks, I mean, I think that this is a really is a good way to capture and encapsulate a lot of the work that I've been trying to explore in the past 10 years. Is really trying to ask, what is natural versus what is synthetic versus what is transnatural. These tidy categories that we used to sort of take comfort in no longer apply, especially with the research being done with genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and artificial intelligence. And so this is my exploration and my statement around, we cannot think of nature in absolute terms any more than we can think about technology in absolute terms. There seems to be a lot of spillover and a lot of hybridization, and this is a sort of outgrowth of that kind of thinking. And I just want to say that, just to further the question around natural versus synthetic, we've been engineering our world ever since the dawn of agriculture. That's what it is. We've been selectively engineering and breeding apples and dogs for thousands and thousands of years. And this is nothing new. We have, as a species, as human beings, we have tried to control and manipulate, the natural world around us for a very long time. And so there are going to be, consequences to that, but they're also what makes our life livable. Can you imagine if we didn't have agriculture? Can you imagine if we didn't, have this kind of selection process? That being said, it does come with its cautionary, warnings. And so I do believe that we are living in a moment from those kinds of inquiries and impulses from thousands and thousands of years ago.
How many of these did you make, Anicka? Because for me, it's also fascinating that these works are informed by process and research. And how many of these works did you make?
Those silicone panels, I believe there are about 15 of those in the world, give or take one or two. I don't really, I first and foremost, I don't edition my work. So most of the or all of the work is original, but I generally tend to make very, very small, low series of a series. So, you know, partially because I think I'm an impatient person, and I'm just moving on to the next technique, the next process, and I just, you know, but at the same time, you know, if I feel that I've explored what I wanted to with the series, I'm sort of done with it, and then I transition.
Yeah. So we are transitioning now to a piece that has a title that could be the title of our last 8 weeks, Force Majeure. And I'm just reading the Materialist.
Yeah.
Plexiglass, aluminum, agar, bacteria, refrigeration system, LED lights, glass, epoxy, resin, powder-coated stainless steel, light bulbs, digital clocks, silicon, and silk flowers. And this is, of course, an installation shot. I'm going to show one more installation shot here and one detail. Say a bit about this major force, unexpected force.
Well, okay, let me give you the backstory.
Yeah.
All art has a backstory, and I love talking about the backstory. I often like to foreground the backstory in the artwork itself. So when I was awarded the Hugo Boss Prize in 2016, it came with an exhibition at the Guggenheim. And that was right when Trump got elected. And I was really stumped and really flummoxed. And I thought, well, what is my role as an artist? How do I tackle this? And I have to say, it gave me pause. It really, really did. You know, not only was I certainly nervous and intimidated to make an exhibition at the Guggenheim, but also at a moment where, you know, I believe at the time, you know, Trump had enacted the Muslim ban, you know, where everyone, you know, with Muslim backgrounds were either questioned, detained, and there was a lot of, you know, Islamophobia, and that was very disconcerting to me. And so I wanted to create an entry point into the exhibition by creating this very sort of cramped, claustrophobic entry holding pen, as it were. That's what I'm calling it. And so then you enter in, and there are these canisters that are transmitting this hybridized smell that I worked with a forensic chemist to hybridize the smell of Asian American women. I took sweat samples and I did a chemical reading on the sweat, and then I combined it with carpenter ants, the smell of carpenter ants, and I created this hybrid smell. And the backstory to this also is that these structural biologists that I worked with on this exhibition up at Columbia University, I asked them, I said, okay, here's my idea. I want to create a drug. Can you help me create a drug that would allow a human being to perceive the reality of a pink dolphin or a coral reef or even another human being? And that's what I wanted to do for the Guggenheim exhibition. I wanted to synthesize a drug that would allow humans to experience the perceptual reality of other organisms. And they humored me. They didn't laugh at me right in my face, but they did eventually say, that is biologically, technologically impossible at the moment, because if you want to experience the reality of a pink dolphin, we would have to remold and model your brain to the brain of a pink dolphin and the neural networks of a pink dolphin. And we just don't have the technology for that. And I said, oh, got it. Okay. So.
Yeah, but I do remember your very oceanic approach. I remember it must have been the same year you did this 3D video at the Whitney Biennial. That you, at the time, I remember you described that if it's 3D, it's closer to smell as a perception. in a way. And we are going here to a work which I think is really fascinating. 30,000 years Pliocene Park, high density form resin and snake skin. So that's from the year after, so that's from 2018. Say a little bit about this piece, because many of the pieces we looked at the moment, they have organic and synthetic materials mixed. They often have a process that is still continuing to disintegrate, to mold, to develop. But often they also have like electricity in them. There is also, when you talked about the viral and the viral, I remember in the 90s, we often defined works as dry or wet. So that's a fascinating, if you talk about this here, how would you describe this work?
Well, so I like to work and interpret through different cross platforms. And what I mean by that is, in the previous slide, I grew living bacteria in the Guggenheim. And so what I like to do is I like to pivot between different forms. And so this is more of a kind of formal representation of the microscopic and the amoebic forms. So these sort of like amoeba shapes, that's what you're seeing. And so I like to play with different kinds of forms. So I like to work with the actual living organism, and then I'll turn it into a scent, and then I'll turn it into a synthetic sort of, pictorial plane with high density foam and resin, as it were. And so this is my way of being able to articulate certain ideas and ask certain questions around different sort of formal sort of registries. It's not enough to work with one kind of entity in a biological form. I like to go into microscopic. I like to go into sort of olfactive, chemical compounds. And this is an extension of that kind of practice, that way of thinking in this kind of very sort of cross-vector, sort of being able to do this kind of mental jujitsu around formal language. And so these are microscopic shapes. These are amoeba, essentially. And again, it's riffing on this kind of hybridity, working with the snake skin, which is actual living snake skin, and then these very, very highly industrialized forms like resin and foam, and the frame and what have you. And so it's this constant fluidity and hybridity between the industrial and the organic.
You talked about the pictorial, and then I'm moved to the next slide. Same year, a need shaped in the wild, which in some aspect feels like returning to the flower reliefs, but then it does not, because it really is a departure from there. Say a bit about this specific work here, please.
So this work was inspired out of the series that was created from the Suranum exhibition, Jungle Stripe. And so what you're seeing is this massive panel of silicone that's stretched over this wooden panel. And what I did was I took molds from octopus tentacle suction and created a sort of myriad pattern of octopus tentacle suction. And so there's a tremendous amount of texture and sort of tactility. Again, my interest in the sensorium, where not only does it activate an ocular sense, but also a tactile haptic sense. I think that a lot of my work, people want to touch the work. They not only want to look at it, but they want to touch it. They want to run their fingers around the textures. And this is an example of something like that, where I really want to almost kind of like if your hands could salivate, and like want to touch something. And that's where this work was also sort of taking a sliver out of the sort of, I guess, from my Amazonian trip in Brazil as well, this kind of botanical sort of language that I kept coming back to.
Yeah, I remember in the very early, some of the early profiles on you or articles, you were sometimes described as techno-sensual, which is perhaps this tactile, you want to touch it. I remember seeing works of yours in galleries, and I went with a friend and she was about to touch it. I said, no, 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 please, it's a work of art, it's on the wall, let's not touch it. But I think there is very much this quality that this nearly is like a reflex. You want to touch it. Going to the next piece here.
Yeah.
14 medical detection dogs. And we have 2 images of just going to also show you the next one. Here's, you see a little bit better. What are we looking at, Anicka?
So
what are we looking at?
This is another example of what I was saying about, you know, trying to extrapolate different forms. So these are sort of photographs, you know, images that were taken from the Guggenheim living bacteria. And they're turned into a photograph, and then you have this kind of plexiglass grid that goes on top, and then you have these kinds of sort of laboratory sort of orbs that were hand blown specifically for this sculpture. But I want to talk about the title a little bit, which is really fun, because medical detection dogs are ostensibly they're dogs that are trained to detect cancer, because as we know, cancer has a very, very pungent, distinctive odor. You know, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer. And so we have traditionally worked with dogs and trained dogs to detect any kind of cancerous odors. Currently, there are some MIT scientists who are trying to develop an algorithm that would be able to enable your cell phone to detect your cancer smell. So for example, you might be sitting at home and your phone might start beeping and it will tell you, oh, we smell, you know, skin cancer stage 3. You might want to call a doctor or something like that. And I know that has a lot of bioethical concerns that come with it.
No, no, it's a dream or a nightmare. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, to have your phone tell you you have cancer is a little bit stressful. I recognize that. But so the 14 medical detection dogs comes from that tradition, that our you know, that our organs, our bodies, you know, we transmit an odor, and that odor is, you know, like we have developed a very acute sense of smell because we're supposed to communicate biological information to each other. That's how our noses work. That's how the gut sensors have scent receptors as well, you know? And so this is really a kind of a sort of like an industrialist sort of, you know, riff on what I was just saying about this kind of this containment of the biological, the microbiological, and you know, where it's heading. Yes.
I'm going.
Yes.
I'm going through the next 4 slides, and let's indulge in the title: "Releasing the Human from the Human."
Yes. Yeah. I really meant it. Still do. Releasing the human from the human. What this title for me means, it really, really captures a lot of the work, investigation that I've been doing for the past 10 years, which is that which we think of the human is not this category, this substance that we used to think. You know, each generation has to define itself, and I believe that, you know, in the first you know, 20 years of the 21st century, we really need to think of the human in a different way, through what we've learned through scientific research, through machine intelligence research, and that we are not what we thought we were in the 20th century, much less the 15th century. And so it is my hope that we can release ourselves from these categories, these definitions that don't really suit us or serve us well. You know, to think that we are one thing when we actually aren't, from a scientific biological point of view. So what we're looking at here are these sculptures that are laminated with algae. And this is a culmination of a 2.5-year research project that I embarked upon with my studio. And when I say studio, I just want to say that, although earlier I said, my core team are these three, people that I work with, but my studio is really a network of, synthetic biologists, forensic chemists, etymologists. I mean, that to me is what I consider the studio, a multidisciplinary network of specialists and just really brilliant minds who are really pushing, the needle forward in terms of, technology and scientific research. And so 2.5 years, we researched algae. Algae is the largest biomass on the planet. It is being used as an alternative to fossil fuel. It's being used as an alternative in the form of biofuel. It's being used as an alternative to plastic in the form of biopolymers. And so I was just deeply fascinated with algae, and so I wanted to create a sort of use it as a substrate for sculptural lamination. And so this is what we came up with. And, we worked with a remarkable conservator, Christian Scheidemann, who has a studio here in New York. We worked with a biopolymer chemist from MIT. We worked with an independent laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts for tensile strength, accelerated aging tests. We went pretty rigorous with our research because we really wanted to test the limits of this material and see what the possibilities were.
Yeah, this is really like creating a membrane between the natural and the synthetic, between the machine and the living organism. This was is one of the installation views. I think that's Venice, right?
It is.
Yeah, and you have these kind of little craters on the ground, and describe a little bit what your sculptural thinking was behind, because you are so generous in giving us backstories and narratives and your wider thinking about it. But of course, you're also a sculptor, you're also a visual artist. What makes you find this form? What makes you find this form? Is this also a product of research, or is that an aesthetic process, a decision?
It's all of it, Klaus. It's all of it. We could start with the title, Biologizing the Machine, Tentacular Trouble. Much as I said that the humans are merging with machines, cyborgian, the Bluetooth, all of that. It's my hope to try to biologize industry and biologize machines as well, because we live symbiotically and we must be more symbiotic, and so this is an attempt to try to biologize machines. You can't tell in this slide, but there are also internally inside of these sort of biomorphic shapes, or I call them pupae, pods, a chrysalis, is that there's animatronic insects inside of these sculptures, and they're fluttering around to almost kind of like a trapped moth, to a flame, and they're emerging out of these craters, as you mentioned, that are filled with this pools of liquid. And so it's uncertain. You don't know where the body begins and ends, and this landscape begins and ends. And it's to me, it's apparent that they didn't sort of just land from Mars and from outer space, that they have actually potentially emerged from the Earth. And so that this is something that is quite earthly, something that we can relate to as inhabitants of this planet, versus something that comes from outer space, as it were. In terms of the formal language, the sculptural language, I was just very attracted to these sort of insect shapes. I am attracted to insects because a lot of insects tend to be very matriarchal in their societal structure. A lot of insects tend to be blind and almost entirely guided by their sense of smell, like in the case of ants, which is something that I worked with in the Guggenheim exhibition and a lot of ants. And so you know, insects tend to be an enduring source of research and inspiration for me, because much of our research around olfaction is actually being done through insects, because they have such a highly developed sense of smell, and this is how they organize their entire existence.
Olfaction, of course, is such a uh, hot topic right now, because we are suffering from a disease that is, we are in midst of a pandemic that's a respiratory pandemic.
Mm.
And many of us are wearing masks. So you said you don't know where the body ends, where the body starts. Of course, the inhaling of different RNA, DNA particles into your bodies that start reproducing in your bodies. These are like cocoons where you have the membranes that you develop. So I think it's fascinating how often your work is thinking about either the porousness of where does it start, where does it end, and then the clear containment of it. And I'm going to one more slide here. Adaptive ecorhythms from this year. God, it's good to see 2020 here in a positive note. Say a bit about this work. Is this a size? I would say this is 3x4 and a half feet, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's meter by a meter 50. Adaptive ecorhythms. What are adaptive ecorhythms?
Well, you know, I think that, again, continuing on certain sort of themes about symbiosis, about adaptation, I mean, that you could say encapsulates, you know, all of life and all of evolution. And so this is a kind of, this is a work around that. These are inspired by sea anemones, but they also look like molecular cells. And so I like that kind of sort of like, you know, this association and this kind of scrambling of this kind of sort of visual language around that. And so these are a new series that I've created, started in 2019 and have continued on in 2020 of this year. And these are just, I'm just so fascinated by microscopic language, microscopic, you know, sort of movement and life, you know, and so there is this kind of connection to the sort of the ocular and the sight, and what we, you know, are just recently, I think, you know, permitted to see all this life around us that we, through the naked eye, the naked human eye, found invisible. And so this is a way of penetrating, you know, trying to look deeper and further, you know, than what we, you know, sort of see around us when we're just walking down the street, as it were. And so I think the virus also plays a really big role in that, and sort of stoking our anxiety, because we cannot see the virus unless it's under a microscope. And this is what I'm trying to do with this series, is trying to bring into focus that which is invisible to us and our reality throughout our existence. And this is, you know, this life, this origin story, this narrative that is teeming all around us, on our skin, our eyelashes, and everything, you know, and this kind of, you know, again, the zoonotic spillover of multi-species overlapping with each other. And so, yeah, but like, to go back to your point in the previous slide with air, you know, olfaction is so important, I think, you know, for my practice as well as other artists who work with olfaction, because it really, it uses air as a medium. It brings air as a medium into a museum like MOCA, and starts to talk about that as a site for political and social discourse, because you're dealing with, again, invisible compounds, molecular compounds, and you know, and I like to use olfaction sculpturally, linguistically, because it has volume, because it has shape-shifting qualities, and first and foremost, it's a transcorporeal exchange that the visitor, whether it's a human or a spider in the room or a microbe or a dog that comes to visit MOCA, there is a kind of collaborative, non-passive experience of art. You take it into your pores, you take it into your body, and that's how you experience my artwork. There's an exchange there, there's an agreement, a contract, so to speak, and that's what is so fascinating for me, and so important for me to continue to do the research and the work in olfaction, because we are not these discrete bodies, as you said, right? We're leaking. We don't know where we're going.
Talking about leaking, I'm not asking you to leak about the Tate, because of course the Tate Turbine Hall is always such a big reveal, surprise, it's happening, it's new. I'm not asking you to reveal anything, to leak anything. What is so fascinating is that the Tate Turbine Hall is perhaps the epitome of site-specific. So you have this very, very large public space that is a site, it's a definition of being site-specific. Certain times are are more predestined to be time-specific, right? Right now is a moment, it's very difficult to not acknowledge what we're going through. Will the Tate, that's my only question, that's my last question, will the Tate work be not only site-specific, but also time-specific of this moment? Of this moment right now?
Oh, absolutely. There's no way that it can't be. It will be exceedingly site-specific. It will be, I can talk a little bit about it without going into too much detail, but it's focused around machine intelligence. It's focused around a kind of aquarium of machines, a natural history of machines, and I'm interested in thinking about a machine microbiome. I'm thinking about a machine sensorium. I'm thinking about machines and contagion. I'm thinking about lots of those questions, and so London being an early industrial city, and the origin of Turbine Hall as an energy conversion. To me, it seemed like a logical extension to go very rigorous with machine intelligence.
It's amazing. Thank you, Anicka. This was such an amazing and generous studio visit to share all of these insights with you. Thank you.